Okay, I thought I would do something with platforms. So I've already kind of pre-made a few things here, just some basic stuff. Um, for one, I have a little player here, and he's just got a character controller. And if we look at his logic, he just has, we're just getting a vector. I figured I'll kind of keep it in like a 2D realm. Not that it's really going to matter, but for this, I'll keep it in 2D realm. So after I get the vector, I'm going to set the Z to 0, and then we're going to move at a speed. I'm just using world space, and if we hit the space bar button, I'm just going to use the controller jump. Okay, so we have essentially we can move back and forth. We can't move up and down, but if we hit space, we have a little jump, right? And we have a platform that moves around. Actually, I've got a few of them. And I should have dropped that jump down so it's not so hard to do. Maybe I will do that. Let's just bring that jump down to a height of maybe 3. So we go and we can do a little jump. We land on it and we don't stick to it at all. We just slide right off the stupid thing. All right, common issue. Right, there we go. Now, I have another controller. Here that is essentially the same thing, but I'm using a rigid body. So as you can see, we have get axis vector, and I set the Y and the Z both to 0, and I'm just using set velocity. And then when we jump, I'm using an add force. Probably bring that down a bit. A tiny weight, and then we're doing a ray cast downwards to see if we've hit the ground. Right, so same idea. And if I come over here and I jump, I can land on it, but it's the same idea. It just moves away. Right, I don't have a falling mechanism in this, so. But we aren't sticking to this this platform. So I'm just going to turn the logic off on the platform for a second and jump on it. Now, if I was to move the platform up and down, well, we got a little bit of an issue there, but it kind of somewhat works. So I've made 3 different platforms. One is move towards. So I am getting the position. I'm adding to the position, world space, and then I'm moving towards that position. I do a wait. We just pause, wait while we're not moving, move in the other direction, right? And that one obviously isn't working well for us. Next, I also have the same thing, but just a translate. And it does the same thing. It just goes back and forth. And as you see, it doesn't matter which controller I use, is we can't stick on this platform. It just slides out from underneath us. So then I also have a physics block, which is the same thing again, but now we're using the set velocity. Okay, so you would think I'm using a rigid body controller and we have a physical object that's velocity, we should stick to this thing. Right? That's, you would only assume that. Why not? Oh, I jumped over it. But again, here we are sliding off of it. So how do we resolve that? Well, one of the reasons why we're sliding off this thing is you also got to remember is here, if we aren't pushing any direction whatsoever, we have a velocity coming in of 0, going left and right. Right? My velocity is a 4, -4, but it's a 0. 0 is still a velocity, right? So even if I was to hop on something in a physical aspect, my velocity is 0. It doesn't match this velocity. So there's a few different ways we can resolve that. One is we could actually duplicate this state, right? And instead of, like, we have this, but we can also get vector 3 length, or maybe it's not a get, maybe it's just a vector length. Just do get, there we go, get vector length. Okay, it's not called vector 3, it's just called get vector length. So get vector length of this every frame, and let's just call this length. And more or less what we can do now with this is float compare, and if the length is, we'll say, less than 0.25, if it's less than that, we're in an idle state. So let's move this down, and if we're in an idle state, let's come down here. And vice versa, let's do the same thing. Let's just copy this logic, bring it over here, stuff it in here. Only now, if we're greater, we can move. Right? So the only difference here now is we don't want to set velocity. Or if we do want to set velocity, let's set it to 0, but not every frame. Put it at the very top. So now we're just getting the axis vector, and that's it. So we're not actually telling anything to move. And if we jump, we can literally just do that same thing, drag it over there. So logic-wise here, everything's the same. Everything feels the same. Nothing's technically changed. But now we're running two different states. And in one state, we're controlling the velocity. The other one, we're not. Right? And it gives us the one advantage of if we actually were to go jump on something, if I can do it. Now that I'm idle, I'm not telling this thing to change its velocity. It's doing that on its own, right? So now all of a sudden I can ride on it just by doing that. And that's with a rigid body controller using a physics block. Now, if we use the translate, I don't know if that's going to work for us. Let's see. We come over here. So we still have our idle. We're not controlling velocity, but the block is translating. So it's not paying attention to the physics system. It's not working. We can try the move towards logic block. And it is using the physics, but it uses it in actually a different way. So let's see how it works. And you know, it kind of works. Oh, stupid block, come here. No, see, it's not working either. So how can we stick to these other blocks? I mean, we could make everything physics blocks if you're running physics. What if you're running a character controller? Character controller, if we try to do that same logic, we might have an issue. So let's we need a float compare, and a length. So let's bring those back in. So we're going to get a length of V every frame. So there's length. Take both of these, let's bring them down at the bottom. And let's float compare length to, 0.25 again. And if we're greater, no, if we're less, let's go into an idle state. And if we're in an idle state, let's copy this one, paste him down. Let's change that one so we don't get confused. We don't want simple move, or do we? Right? Let's get rid of that. So let's do is greater, we are moving again. And if we're moving again, right there. And if we jump, we can go there. So technically the logic is the same as the rigid body now, right? But there are obviously some differences. One's using physics, one's not. And as you see, that's not working too well for us. And if I try to use a physics block, again, it's probably not going to work too well for us. We jump on it, and there we go. And if I use the translate block, it'll probably be even, well, it won't work either, but I was going to say it's going to be worse, but I guess it can't really be worse than just not working, right? So, what have we learned so far? We've learned that if we're running a rigid body, we can use a physics block as long as when we've stopped, we're not telling this thing to use a velocity. We're just letting it do whatever it can on these blocks. So the other thing we can do is, say you look at something like this. Okay, let's create a cube, another cube. Let's raise this one up. Maybe scale it down just a smidge. That might be a little too much. On the X, let's make it a trigger and get rid of this stuff. So now we have a trigger. Okay, so what we could do now is have, okay, please, is if we have a, over here, we have trigger enter, and we have a system trigger exit. Because really there should only be one thing jumping on here, and you always could use the trigger events instead. So get trigger info. So the object, and once we have an object, we can set parent of whatever triggered this to, I don't know, say ourselves. And again, we can do the exact same logic over here, only now the parent is done, right? And that should give us, let's try to time this, and if we jump, we come in and we've parented. So we're using the character control, and as you see, we're now a child of this translating block, and everything looks like we're fine. And I can still, oops, here I am hitting buttons in the wrong windows, and I can still move, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And if I jump, I'm not parented. I can leave. I can go and I can jump on this and we can become a parent. Just like that. Pretty cool, huh? And the same logic here on this guy. So let's just duplicate him. We could put on the move towards. We could put it on the physics block. Let's zero their positions. Let's hide this guy. Let's take the physics block. And let's double check on this logic, right? Because we don't want it to pair it to the translate block. We want to pair it to this block. And that one's going to none. Let's check on this guy. We want to parent to this block. Right, so now with the physics block and a character controller, oh, we didn't parent to that one. Let's see what has happened. And that's probably due, you know what, because we have a physics block. Copy that. And I should have known better. Take this logic off. Stick it on here. So I put the logic up here because he has a rigid body on the root. So we come over. Oh, nope, it's still not functioning very well for us. So, why is that? Let's see if we can do this one. Trigger event. Trigger enter. Oh, we'll even set the tag and do an add. And then of course we'd have to change this guy over so he matches that tag. Let's try that one. Nope, that's still not going. So on the physics block, we're definitely having issues with this trigger, which is unfortunate, but so be it. If I put the trigger over on the player, that would probably work fine. I could parent it that way. I think that would work. That might work. If we took a cube, raised it up, trigger, get rid of that. If we added it to the player, let's see if the player triggers that. Let's just do a system like this. Trigger enter. I'm going to turn this logic off so it's not running around, so we can jump on it nice and easy. Now that we know it moves, let's just see if we can parent ourselves to it. And of course, you know, I apparently can't jump. Yeah, so that's not, it fired when we put it on the player. So, okay, so we have this little trigger here. It's sitting a little high. Let's put it down. So now let's get trigger info. So this is our block. And we need to set parent. Only now we're obviously going the opposite direction because we're using ourselves and our parent is the block. Okay, and we can copy this, paste it, change trigger enter to trigger exit, and our parent is now none. And let's turn his logic back on so he's moving around again. And now we're on a physics block. Oh. And it's working just fine. If I jump off, we've unparented. You know, we've parented, but now we have a physical block. You know, there's obviously some differences there, and that's with the character controller. So in the character controller, there's a couple ways. The parenting method works probably the easiest, probably the better of the solutions. If you're running a physics controller, then really paying attention to when you're controlling your velocity, and you got to remember that 0 counts. If you tell it 0, it wants to be a 0 velocity, not matching something. It wants to be 0. So don't tell it anything if you want it to match something, right? So there's a bit of a difference there. So now, now let's play with this guy just a little bit more. Let's go. Oh, that's our player. Let's turn off that logic. Turn on the translate. Turn off him. So here we have this guy. And we can have, say, another one up here. And let's say have one up here. And maybe this guy, instead of going, you know, left and right, which we always could do a vector and put him in here. Now let's have him go up and down. All right, now we have a system like this. And they pause and they do their thing, and we should parent to these objects. Oh, I barely got that. You know, now all of a sudden we have this little bit of a platformer game happening, and all we're doing is parenting to these things, right? Oops. You know, and with them translating and us using a character controller, they should push us, right? So, I mean, you have all of that effect too. But it works pretty good. So there we go. We have platforms. So I'll take a little screenshot so I can use that as a thumb. There we have it, and we'll see you guys in the future.